The throne room fell silent as 20-foot claws tore through reinforced titanium like wet paper. Warlord Kazeth's eyes widened in recognition, just before his ancient seat of power, and he himself split cleanly down the middle. The creature that had once limped on 3 legs through battlefield debris now stood triumphant, its promise fulfilled after 7 long years. But this story of vengeance begins not with destruction, but with an act of unexpected mercy on a dying moon where hope seemed as distant as the nearest star. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The acrid smoke of plasma fire still hung in the thin atmosphere of Kepler 4042c as Captain Dex Holloway picked his way through the wreckage of what had once been a thriving mining colony. His boots crunched on crystallized sand that had been superheated by orbital bombardment, each step sending small puffs of metallic dust into the pale orange sky. The air recycler on his combat suit wheezed with each breath, a constant reminder that this moon was dying just like everything else Warlord Kazeth's forces touched. Dex had arrived 3 days too late, as usual. The distress beacon had taken that long to reach the outer rim where he'd been hunting pirates for the Galactic Bounty Commission. By the time his modified corvette, the Iron Resolve, had translated out of hyperspace, there was nothing left but cooling slag and the occasional piece of debris that might once have been someone's home. The mining platforms that had dotted the surface like mechanical flowers were now twisted metal sculptures, their extraction arms reaching skyward in silent supplication. The mercenary's weathered face remained impassive as he surveyed the devastation, but his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Kepler 442c made the 17th world he'd seen Kazeth's forces destroy in the past 2 years. 17 worlds where families had built lives, where children had played in artificial gardens, where people had dared to hope for something better than the endless cycle of violence that plagued the outer territories. Now it was just another graveyard, another monument to one being's insatiable hunger for dominance. Dex's sensor array indicated no life signs in the immediate area, but he continued his methodical search pattern anyway. Sometimes the sensors missed things, especially when dealing with non-human physiology or advanced stealth technology. He'd learned never to trust his equipment completely, a lesson beaten into him during his 15 years as a colonial marine before he'd gone freelance. Trust your eyes, trust your instincts, and maybe you'd live to see another sunrise. The wind picked up as Kepler 4042c's sun began to set, carrying with it the distinctive metallic taste that came from too much ionized atmosphere. The mining operations had been stripping rare earth elements from the moon's core for over a century, slowly destabilizing its magnetic field. Even without Kazeth's intervention, the colony probably had maybe 50 years left before the place became completely uninhabitable. Now it didn't matter. The timeline had been compressed to zero by forces that cared nothing for the delicate balance between exploitation and sustainability. Something moved in the shadow of an overturned habitat module. Dex's hand moved to the grip of his pulse rifle in one smooth motion, a response so automatic it didn't even register in his conscious mind. The movement came again, smaller this time, accompanied by a sound that was part whimper, part growl. He adjusted his helmet's optical enhancers and peered into the twisted metal cave that had been formed when the habitat's support structure collapsed. 2 eyes stared back at him, reflecting the fading light like amber jewels. As his vision adjusted, he could make out the creature more clearly. It was roughly the size of a large dog, covered in what appeared to be short, iridescent fur that shifted color based on the angle of observation. Its body was lean to the point of emaciation, and one of its 4 legs was clearly injured, bent at an unnatural angle that spoke of either a bad break that had healed wrong or some kind of congenital deformity. The creature's head was elongated, almost reptilian, but its eyes held an intelligence that was unmistakably mammalian. Scars crisscrossed its hide in patterns that suggested both natural predator encounters and something far more deliberate. Burns from energy weapons, cuts from vibroblades, the systematic torture that Kazeth's forces were known to inflict on any creature they encountered. This thing had suffered, survived, and somehow maintained enough strength to keep breathing in the thin atmosphere of a dying world. Dex lowered his rifle slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. He'd encountered plenty of alien fauna during his travels, and most of it fell into 2 categories: Things that wanted to eat him, and things that wanted to run away from him. This creature didn't seem to fit either profile. It watched him with an intensity that suggested evaluation rather than fear or hunger, as if it were trying to determine his intentions before deciding on its own course of action. "Easy there," Dex said softly, his voice carrying clearly through his suit's external speakers. "I'm not going to hurt you." The creature's ears, which had been pressed flat against its skull, twitched forward slightly. It understood him, or at least recognized the tone if not the words. Dex had seen enough xenobiology reports to know that many species develop some form of linguistic comprehension when exposed to galactic standard for extended periods. The mining colonies always used alien labor when they could get it, sapient or otherwise, and universal translators had a way of breaking down communication barriers even between radically different species. Slowly, carefully, Dex reached into one of the supply pouches on his belt and withdrew a field ration. The protein bar was designed to be nutritionally compatible with most carbon-based life forms, part of the standard kit for anyone who might find themselves stranded on an unknown world. He broke off a piece and tossed it gently toward the creature, being careful not to make any sudden movements that might be interpreted as aggressive. The creature sniffed the air, its nostrils flaring. After a moment of consideration, it stretched its neck forward and delicately picked up the food. Dex watched as it chewed experimentally, its expression shifting from wariness to something that might have been surprise. Apparently the taste was acceptable, because it swallowed and looked back at him with what could only be described as hopeful expectation. "Hungry, huh?" Dex muttered, breaking off another piece. "Yeah, I bet you are. Doesn't look like there's been much to eat around here lately." As he continued to feed the creature, Dex found himself studying its scars more closely. The pattern was too systematic to be accidental, too precise to be the result of random violence. Someone had hurt this animal deliberately, methodically, with the kind of cold calculation that spoke of either scientific experimentation or pure sadism. Given what he knew about Kazeth's forces, it was probably both. The creature finished the protein bar and looked at him expectantly. Its injured leg was clearly causing it pain. He could see how it favored the other 3 limbs when it shifted position. But there was something else in its posture. Something that suggested this wasn't a creature that was used to receiving kindness from bipedal beings. Every muscle in its body was coiled for flight, ready to bolt at the first sign of betrayal. Dex made a decision that would have seemed insane to anyone who knew him well. He was a mercenary, a professional killer who worked alone and trusted no one. His ship was his sanctuary, his weapons were his family, and emotional attachments were a luxury he couldn't afford in his line of work. But something about this creature, this survivor of unimaginable cruelty, resonated with something deep in his chest that he'd thought had died years ago on a different world, under different circumstances. "Come on," he said, backing away from the habitat wreckage slowly. "Let's get you out of here." The creature hesitated, its eyes darting between Dex and the shadows that had sheltered it. Trust was clearly not something that came easily, and Dex couldn't blame it for that. He'd learned the same lesson himself, albeit through different forms of betrayal. But eventually hunger and desperation won out over caution, and the creature began to follow him, its limp more pronounced as it moved across the uneven terrain. The walk back to the Iron Resolve took nearly an hour, partly because Dex kept his pace slow to accommodate his new companion's injury, and partly because he found himself stopping frequently to scan for threats. The creature's presence made him feel responsible in a way he hadn't experienced in years, and he discovered that responsibility came with its own form of hypervigilance. Every shadow could hide an enemy, every sound could herald an attack, and the small life limping along behind him suddenly seemed infinitely precious and fragile. The Iron Resolve squatted on the landing pad like a predatory insect, all angles and armor plating designed for function rather than aesthetics. Dex had modified the Corvette extensively over the years, adding weapon systems, defensive countermeasures, and sensor arrays that pushed the boundaries of both physics and legality. The ship was his life's work, his masterpiece, and the only thing in the galaxy he truly trusted. As they approached the cargo ramp, the creature stopped and let out a low growl. Its hackles rose, and its good leg tensed, as if preparing to flee. Dex realized that the ship probably triggered unpleasant associations. Spacecraft were likely connected with the beings who had tortured it and destroyed its world. He could see the internal struggle playing out in its posture, the conflict between desperate need and traumatic memory. "It's okay," he said softly, crouching down to bring himself closer to the creature's level. "This isn't one of their ships. This one's mine, and nobody's going to hurt you here." He extended his hand slowly, palm up, letting the creature decide whether to accept the gesture. After a long moment, it stretched its neck forward and sniffed his gloved fingers. Whatever it detected there seemed to satisfy some internal criteria, because it took a tentative step forward, then another. The interior of the Iron Resolve was cramped but efficient, every cubic centimeter of space optimized for maximum utility. The cargo hold doubled as a workshop, the galley could be converted into a field medical station, and the living quarters were Spartanly functional with just enough personal touches to remind Dex that he was still human. The creature's eyes went wide as it took in the environment, probably the first truly safe space it had experienced in months, or possibly years. Dex activated the ship's medical scanner and ran it over the creature from a respectful distance. The results confirmed what he'd suspected: severe malnutrition, multiple partially healed fractures, and extensive soft tissue damage consistent with prolonged abuse. The injured leg wasn't broken, but the tendons had been deliberately severed and had healed incorrectly, leaving the limb partially paralyzed. Someone had wanted this creature to survive but suffer, a level of cruelty that made Dex's hands clench into fists. Over the next several hours, he did what he could to make his unexpected passenger comfortable. He replicated a series of meals with varying nutritional profiles until he found something the creature could digest easily. He set up a sleeping area in the corner of the cargo hold, using emergency blankets to create a nest-like structure that seemed to appeal to some instinctive need for security. Most importantly, he simply stayed nearby, reading technical manuals and performing routine maintenance tasks, while the creature gradually relaxed in his presence. The creature slept for nearly 18 hours straight, its body finally allowing itself to rest now that it had found safety. Dex found himself checking on it frequently, ostensibly to monitor its vital signs, but really just to reassure himself that it was still breathing. He'd named it Ghost, partly for its ability to hide in the shadows, and partly for the way it seemed to exist in a liminal space between life and death. When Ghost finally woke, it was with the instant alertness of a creature that had learned to expect danger at any moment. Its eyes found Dex immediately, and he saw something in that gaze that hadn't been there before, a spark of recognition that went beyond simple familiarity. Ghost had accepted him, not just as a provider of food and shelter, but as something approaching a pack-mate. The days that followed established a routine that neither of them had planned, but both seemed to need. Dex would go about his normal activities, maintaining the ship, reviewing job postings, planning his next move, while Ghost observed from a safe distance. The creature was intensely curious about everything, watching Dex work with the focused attention of someone trying to understand not just what he was doing, but why he was doing it. Gradually, Ghost began to venture closer. First, it would position itself just within arm's reach while Dex worked. Then it started actually approaching when called, though it never quite lost the ready-to-flee tension in its posture. Eventually, it allowed Dex to examine its injured leg more thoroughly, even submitting to minor medical procedures without resistance. The leg couldn't be fully repaired without major surgery that Dex wasn't qualified to perform, but he was able to fashion a simple brace that provided support and reduced the creature's obvious pain. Ghost's reaction to this kindness was profound. It spent nearly an hour just staring at the brace, as if unable to believe that someone had taken time to reduce its suffering rather than increase it. As the days turned into weeks, Dex found his entire routine changing to accommodate Ghost's presence. He set up exercise equipment to help the creature rebuild its strength. He modified the ship's atmospheric systems to provide optimal air quality for Ghost's respiratory needs. Most significantly, he found himself talking to the creature constantly, sharing his thoughts and observations in a way he hadn't done with another being in years. Ghost proved to be an excellent listener, its intelligent eyes tracking every word and gesture. Sometimes Dex could swear the creature understood not just the meaning of his words, but their emotional subtext as well. When he talked about past missions, Ghost would tilt its head in what seemed like sympathy. When he expressed frustration with the current state of the galaxy, Ghost's ears would flatten in what appeared to be agreement. The first time Ghost tried to communicate back was during one of these one-sided conversations. Dex had been explaining the political situation in the Outer Rim, describing how warlords like Kazeth had filled the power vacuum left by the collapse of the old imperial government, when Ghost suddenly let out a series of sounds that were clearly intentional rather than random. The vocalizations were complex, rhythmic, almost musical in their cadence. It was language, or at least an attempt at language. "You're trying to tell me something, aren't you?" Dex said, setting down the plasma conduit he'd been repairing. "I wish I could understand you." Ghost tilted its head and repeated the sequence, then looked at him expectantly. When Dex didn't respond with recognition, Ghost tried a different approach. It moved to the ship's main display screen and began tracing patterns on the surface with its claw. The shapes were geometric, precise, clearly meaningful to Ghost, even if they made no sense to Dex. Over the following weeks, Ghost's attempts at communication became more sophisticated. It learned to operate some of the ship's simpler systems, turning lights on and off, in patterns that seemed to correspond to its vocalizations. It began bringing Dex specific tools when he was working, somehow intuiting what he needed before he asked for it. Most remarkably, it started responding to the ship's sensor readings, alerting Dex to approaching vessels or dangerous spatial phenomena with increasing accuracy. The first real test of their partnership came 3 months after Dex had found Ghost on the dying moon. They were tracking a group of pirates who had been raiding civilian transports in the Vega sector when the Iron Resolve sensors detected an ambush. 6 heavily armed fighters were lying in wait near a supposed distress beacon, ready to disable any ship that came to investigate. Dex was preparing to change course when Ghost suddenly became agitated. The creature began pacing back and forth, making urgent vocalizations, and repeatedly touching the weapon's control panel. It took Dex several minutes to understand what Ghost was trying to communicate, but when the meaning finally became clear, his blood ran cold. The energy signatures from the ambush ships matched those of the vessels that had destroyed the mining colony on Kepler 4042 CE. These weren't ordinary pirates. They were Kazeth's raiders, and they were using innocent civilians as bait. "You remember them, don't you?" Dex said quietly, watching as Ghost's hackles rose and its claws extended. "You remember what they did." Ghost's response was a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from somewhere deep in its chest. The sound was filled with such concentrated hatred that Dex actually took a step back. In that moment, he caught a glimpse of what Ghost might become if its full potential were ever unleashed. The creature he'd rescued was not just a survivor, it was a weapon waiting for the right moment to strike. The attack on the raiders was swift and decisive. Dex used the Iron Resolve's superior maneuverability to pick off the fighters one by one, while Ghost somehow managed to boost the ship's targeting systems in ways that should have been impossible. The creature's claws moved across the console with supernatural precision, interfacing with the ship's computer in a manner that defied conventional understanding of both biology and technology. In the aftermath of the battle, as they were searching the wreckage for survivors, Dex made a discovery that changed everything. Hidden in the lead fighter's data core was intelligence about Kazeth's next target, a peaceful research station where xenobiologists were studying methods of healing traumatized alien species. The irony wasn't lost on him. Kazeth was planning to destroy the very people who might have been able to help creatures like Ghost. "We're going to stop him," Dex said, turning to look at Ghost. "Not just this attack, but all of it. Somehow, we're going to make him pay for what he's done." Ghost's response was immediate and unmistakable. The creature stood to its full height, which Dex suddenly realized was considerably more impressive than he'd initially thought, and let out a roar that reverberated through the ship's hull. It wasn't the sound of an animal, it was the battle cry of a warrior accepting a challenge. In that moment, Dex understood that Ghost wasn't just agreeing to help him, it was claiming the mission as its own. The months that followed were a period of intense preparation and gradual revelation. As Ghost grew stronger and more confident, its true nature began to emerge. The creature, that had once cowered in the shadows of a wrecked habitat, now moved with the fluid grace of an apex predator. Its injured leg, while still impaired, no longer seemed to significantly limit its mobility. Most importantly, its intelligence continued to develop at a rate that suggested capabilities far beyond those of an ordinary animal. Ghost learned to operate increasingly complex ship systems, eventually taking over navigation and sensor duties almost entirely. Its ability to process multiple data streams simultaneously far exceeded Dex's own capabilities, and its tactical instincts proved invaluable during their ongoing campaign against Kazeth's forces. More than once, Ghost's warnings had saved them from ambushes or traps that Dex's equipment had failed to detect. But it was Ghost's physical development that truly amazed Dex. The creature that had once weighed perhaps 40 kilograms now tipped the scales at over 200, its frame filling out with dense muscle that rippled beneath its color-shifting hide. Its claws, which had seemed merely sharp when they first met, now appeared capable of cutting through reinforced alloy. Most remarkably, Ghost had developed what could only be described as natural armor, thick plates that protected its vital organs while maintaining full range of motion. The transformation wasn't just physical. Ghost's communication skills had evolved to the point where it could operate the ship's computer interface directly, typing out complex messages on the keyboard with surprising dexterity. Its understanding of galactic politics, military tactics, and even human psychology had grown exponentially through observation, and what Dex suspected was some form of accelerated learning capability. Their first major victory came when they intercepted a Kazeth supply convoy, carrying prisoners from a recently conquered world. The operation required split-second timing and perfect coordination between ship and crew. Ghost had plotted the intercept course, identified the convoy's weaknesses, and executed a boarding action that rescued over 300 civilians while eliminating the entire raider escort. But it was during this mission that Dex got his first real glimpse of Ghost's combat capabilities. The creature had insisted on joining the boarding party, despite Dex's concerns about exposing it to direct combat. What he witnessed in the corridors of the prison transport changed his entire understanding of what his companion truly was. Ghost moved through the enemy ship like a force of nature, its claws slicing through armor and weapons with contemptuous ease. Raiders who had terrorized entire sectors fled in panic at the sight of the creature bearing down on them. But what struck Dex most profoundly was Ghost's restraint. It killed only when necessary, using precise strikes to disable rather than destroy whenever possible. This wasn't mindless savagery, it was controlled violence, applied with surgical precision. In the aftermath of the rescue, as they were transferring the liberated prisoners to a safe haven, one of the survivors approached Dex with tears streaming down her face. She was an elderly xenobiologist named Dr. Sarah Chen, and her words would haunt him for years to come. "That creature," she said, pointing at Ghost with a trembling finger. "Do you know what it is?" "A survivor," Dex replied. "Like all of us." Dr. Chen shook her head. "No, you don't understand. I've studied the reports from Kepler 442c, analyzed the biological samples that were recovered before the attack. That's a Nexari, one of the apex predators from the moon's deep cavern systems. They're not just intelligent, they're empathic. They can sense the emotional states of other beings, share memories through direct contact, even form permanent psychic bonds with individuals they trust." End quote. Dex felt something cold settle in his stomach. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that creature has chosen you as its bonded partner. In Nexari culture, that's a connection that transcends death itself. It will follow you anywhere, protect you at any cost, and when the time comes, it will die for you without hesitation." Dr. Chen's expression grew grave. "But more importantly, if you're ever killed by an enemy, it will hunt that enemy to the ends of the galaxy. Nexari never forget, and they never forgive." That night, as they traveled through hyperspace toward their next destination, Dex sat in the ship's observation lounge and watched Ghost sleep. The creature had grown so large that it barely fit in the space that had once seemed more than adequate, its powerful form rising and falling with each breath. In sleep, Ghost looked peaceful, almost innocent, but Dex now knew that he was looking at one of the galaxy's most formidable predators, a being whose loyalty was absolute and whose capacity for vengeance was limitless. He thought about Dr. Chen's words, about the bond that had formed between them without his knowledge or conscious consent. The idea should have been terrifying. The thought that another being's entire existence was now tied to his own should have sent him running for the nearest exit. Instead, he felt a profound sense of responsibility settling over him like a familiar cloak. Ghost stirred in its sleep, and for a moment, its eyes opened to meet Dex's gaze. In that brief connection, Dex felt something pass between them, an understanding that went beyond words or even conscious thought. Ghost knew that Dex now understood their true relationship, and Dex knew that Ghost had been waiting for this moment of recognition. They were no longer rescuer and rescued, human and alien, commander and companion. They were bonded, linked by ties that transcended species and mortality itself. The next 3 years passed in a blur of constant warfare. Dex and Ghost became legends in the Outer Rim, the mysterious pair who struck without warning and vanished like smoke. They liberated occupied worlds, rescued prisoners, destroyed supply lines, and gradually turned the tide against Kazeth's expanding empire. But no matter how many victories they achieved, the Warlord himself remained frustratingly elusive. Ghost continued to grow, both physically and mentally. The creature now stood nearly 3 meters tall at the shoulder, its mass approaching half a ton of muscle, bone, and natural armor. Its intelligence had evolved to the point where it could operate the Iron Resolve independently, conducting repairs and modifications that improved the ship's performance beyond anything Dex could have achieved alone. Most remarkably, Ghost had begun to exhibit what could only be described as strategic thinking on a galactic scale, analyzing patterns in Kazeth's movements and predicting his next moves with uncanny accuracy. It was Ghost who first detected the signs that Kazeth was planning something unprecedented. The Warlord's forces had begun consolidating around his home system, recalling ships and personnel from across the galaxy. Intelligence reports suggested that he was preparing for some kind of grand celebration, a victory parade to commemorate his conquests and demonstrate his absolute power to any who might challenge him. The opportunity they had been waiting for was finally presenting itself. Kazeth would be vulnerable, surrounded by ceremony and spectacle rather than the layers of security that normally protected him. But the window would be brief, and the chances of success were minimal at best. It would require everything they had learned, every advantage they had gained, and a level of coordination that would push both of them beyond their limits. Dex spent weeks planning the assault, analyzing every piece of intelligence they could gather about Kazeth's stronghold and the upcoming celebration. The fortress was built into an asteroid, its surface bristling with defensive weapons and sensor arrays. The parade route would be heavily guarded, lined with loyal troops, and protected by multiple layers of security shields. Getting close enough to strike would require penetrating defenses that had never been breached by any hostile force. But Ghost had a plan. The creature had been studying the fortress for months, using the Iron Resolve's long-range sensors to map every detail of its construction. Through some form of analysis that Dex didn't fully understand, Ghost had identified a weakness in the asteroid's structure, a fault line that ran directly beneath the throne room where Kazeth would hold court during the victory celebration. If they could trigger a seismic charge at precisely the right moment, they could bring down the entire complex. The problem was delivery. The fault line was deep within the asteroid, accessible only through a network of maintenance tunnels that were too small for conventional explosives and too heavily monitored for stealth infiltration. But Ghost's claws had continued to evolve, developing molecular-scale cutting edges that could slice through any known material. If the creature could reach the fault line, it could trigger a collapse using nothing but its natural weapons. The infiltration itself was a masterpiece of timing and precision. Dex used the Iron Resolve's cloaking systems to approach the asteroid during the height of the celebration, when sensor operators would be distracted by the pageantry and defensive crews would be focused on the crowds rather than potential threats. Ghost had modified itself for the mission, somehow retracting its bulk to fit through spaces that should have been impossible for a creature of its size. The journey through the maintenance tunnels took nearly 4 hours, with Ghost navigating by instinct and memory through a maze of passages that had never been properly mapped. Dex monitored its progress through a quantum-encrypted comlink, his heart racing every time Ghost's signal disappeared behind layers of rock and metal. The creature was completely on its own down there, beyond any help he could provide if something went wrong. When Ghost finally reached the fault line, It began the delicate process of scoring precise cuts into the asteroid's structure. The work required incredible patience and surgical precision. One wrong move could trigger a premature collapse that would kill Ghost and fail to reach Kazeth. But Ghost had been preparing for this moment for years, and its movements were perfect, each cut calculated to maximize the coming destruction while ensuring its own survival. Above, in the throne room, Warlord Kazeth was holding court in a display of power that was both magnificent and horrifying. The chamber was vast, carved from solid rock and decorated with trophies from his conquests. Banners from defeated worlds hung from the walls, while cages containing prisoners from his recent campaigns lined the periphery. At the center of it all sat Kazeth himself, a towering figure in ornate armor who had terrorized the galaxy for over a decade. The throne itself was a work of art and intimidation, carved from a single piece of rare crystalline material and inlaid with precious metals looted from 100 worlds. It had been designed to dwarf anyone who approached it, to reinforce Kazeth's image as a being who towered above ordinary mortals. The warlord sat upon it with casual arrogance, dispensing judgment and death with equal indifference, while his followers cheered and groveled before him. Dex watched through hacked security feeds as the ceremony proceeded, his hands clenched so tightly around the iron resolve's controls that his knuckles had gone white. Every second that passed increased the risk of discovery. Every moment of delay brought them closer to failure. The Ghost was still working, still cutting through layers of stone with methodical precision. The first tremor was barely noticeable, a tiny vibration that most of the celebration's attendees dismissed as the rumble of nearby machinery. But Kazeth felt it. Dex could see the momentary flicker of concern that crossed the warlord's face before he dismissed it and returned his attention to the proceedings. The second tremor was stronger, causing some of the hanging banners to sway and drawing nervous glances from the guards. By the time the third tremor hit, panic was beginning to spread through the throne room. Guests were looking around nervously, some beginning to move toward the exits. But Kazeth remained seated, his pride preventing him from showing any sign of concern even as the floor beneath his feet began to shake with increasing violence. Then, Ghost burst through the floor of the throne room like an avenging angel. The creature had grown even larger during its time in the tunnels, somehow feeding on the asteroid's mineral content to increase its mass and density. It emerged from the shattered stone with a roar that shattered crystal and sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd. But its eyes were focused on only one target, the being who had destroyed its world and tortured its people for sport. Kazeth's guards opened fire immediately, plasma bolts and kinetic rounds filling the air around Ghost's massive form. But the creature's natural armor had evolved to handle far greater punishment than anything conventional weapons could deliver. The shots that struck home simply ricocheted off its hide or were absorbed without visible effect. Ghost moved through the barrage like it was a mild inconvenience, its attention fixed entirely on the throne and its occupant. The warlord finally stood, drawing an ancient blade that crackled with energy fields. His armor was legendary, forged from materials gathered across the galaxy and enhanced with technology that made him effectively invulnerable to normal attack. He had survived assassination attempts by armies and emerged victorious from single combat with beings that could level cities. But as he looked into Ghost's eyes, Dex could see something he had never expected to witness. Kazeth was afraid. The battle that followed was brief but apocalyptic. Kazeth fought with the skill and desperation of someone who finally understood that his reign was ending, his blade leaving trails of superheated plasma as he tried to find some weakness in Ghost's defenses. But the creature that had once cowered in the ruins of a mining colony was now something far beyond the warlord's ability to defeat. Ghost's claws, evolved over years of preparation for this moment, cut through Kazeth's legendary armor like it was made of paper. The warlord's blade, which had carved through starship halls and cleaved mountains, barely scratched Ghost's hide. Each blow from the creature sent shockwaves through the throne room, cracking walls and sending terrified spectators fleeing for their lives. The end came with shocking suddenness. Ghost feinted left, drawing Kazeth's guard in that direction, then struck with its right claw in a movement too fast for the eye to follow. The stroke was perfect, precise, inevitable. It cut through the warlord's chest, through his armor, through his ribs, and deep into the throne behind him. For a moment, Kazeth remained standing, his eyes wide with disbelief. Then the throne began to split, the crystalline structure separating along the line of Ghost's cut. The warlord looked down at his chest, at the line of red that was spreading across his ornate breastplate, and his expression shifted from disbelief to understanding to something that might have been relief. He fell in two pieces, just as his throne crumbled into fragments around him. Ghost stood amid the wreckage, breathing heavily but triumphant. The creature's eyes swept the throne room, taking in the fleeing guests and cowering guards, but finding no other threats worthy of attention. The promise made years ago on a dying moon had been fulfilled. Justice, delayed but not denied, had finally been served. Dex felt tears streaming down his face as he watched through the security feeds. Not tears of sadness, but of profound catharsis. The creature he had rescued, the broken thing that had limped through the ruins of its world, had grown into an instrument of righteous vengeance. But more than that, it had retained its essential nature, its capacity for loyalty and love, even after years of preparation for violence. The aftermath was swift and decisive. Kazeth's empire, held together by fear and the force of his personality, crumbled within hours of his death. His lieutenants turned on each other, his fleet scattered to the winds, and the worlds he had conquered began the long process of rebuilding and healing. The galaxy, which had cowered under his shadow for over a decade, was finally free. Ghost emerged from the asteroid as the fortress crumbled around it, its massive form silhouetted against the flames of destruction. The creature moved with obvious satisfaction, its posture radiating the contentment of a job well done. But as it approached the iron resolve, Dex could see something else in its bearing, a weariness that spoke of a warrior finally laying down its burden. The reunion was emotional in a way that transcended species barriers. Ghost, despite its enormous size, curled up next to Dex like the frightened creature he had first encountered years ago. But there was no fear now, only peace. The bond between them had been tested in the crucible of war and had emerged stronger than ever. In the days that followed, as news of Kazeth's death spread throughout the galaxy, Dex and Ghost found themselves heroes, whether they wanted the title or not. Requests for interviews, offers of employment, and invitations to state ceremonies flooded their communication channels. But they declined them all, preferring the quiet satisfaction of a job well done to the empty praise of strangers. They returned to Kepler 442 CE, to the place where their partnership had begun. The dying moon was still lifeless, still scarred by the violence that had been done to it. But something had changed. The ghosts of the dead seemed to rest easier now that their destroyer had been brought to justice. Dex and Ghost walked among the ruins together, two survivors who had found in each other the strength to not merely endure, but to triumph. As they stood in the shadow of the overturned habitat module where they had first met, Ghost did something it had never done before. The massive creature lowered its great head and nuzzled against Dex's shoulder with surprising gentleness. The gesture was unmistakably affectionate, a moment of pure connection between two beings who had shared the kind of bond that transcends the boundaries of species and circumstance. Dex reached up and placed his hand on Ghost's scarred hide, feeling the steady rhythm of the creature's heartbeat beneath layers of natural armor. In that touch, he felt the echo of everything they had experienced together. The fear and pain of their first meeting, the gradual building of trust, the shared purpose that had driven them across the galaxy, and finally, the cathartic release of justice served. "It's over," he said softly, his words carried away by the thin wind of the dying moon. "We did it. We actually did it." Ghost's response was a low rumble that vibrated through its chest, a sound that conveyed satisfaction, relief, and something deeper that had no human equivalent. The creature that had once been broken and afraid now stood as one of the most formidable beings in the galaxy, but at its core, it remained the loyal companion who had chosen to trust a stranger who offered kindness instead of cruelty. In the weeks that followed their return to civilization, Dex discovered that Ghost's transformation wasn't complete. The creature had developed new capabilities that seemed to emerge almost daily, as if the fulfillment of its purpose had unlocked potential that had been dormant for years. Ghost could now interface directly with quantum computer systems, its consciousness somehow bridging the gap between biological and artificial intelligence. Its empathic abilities had expanded to the point where it could sense emotional states across vast distances, making it an invaluable early warning system for potential threats. But perhaps most remarkably, Ghost had begun to exhibit what could only be described as wisdom. The creature that had once focused solely on survival and vengeance now showed an understanding of complex ethical questions that amazed even Dex. When they encountered situations where violence might have been the easiest solution, Ghost would often suggest alternatives that Dex hadn't considered, approaches that minimized harm while still achieving their objectives. This evolution became particularly evident during their encounter with a group of former Kazeth loyalists who had been terrorizing a refugee camp. The traditional mercenary approach would have been swift and violent, eliminate the threat, and move on to the next job. But Ghost had a different idea, one that involved careful observation, psychological manipulation, and ultimately turning the raiders against each other without firing a single shot. The plan worked perfectly, but more importantly, it demonstrated that Ghost had internalized something profound about the nature of justice and mercy. The creature understood that true victory lay not in destroying one's enemies, but in removing their ability and desire to cause harm. It was a lesson that Dex himself was still learning, guided by the wisdom of a being he had once seen as nothing more than a wounded animal. Their reputation in the mercenary community evolved accordingly. Where once they had been known primarily for their combat effectiveness, they now became famous for their ability to resolve complex situations with minimal collateral damage. Clients who had previously hired traditional guns for hire began seeking them out specifically because of their reputation for finding creative solutions to seemingly intractable problems. But it was during a mission to investigate reports of illegal xenobiological experimentation that Dex learned something that fundamentally changed his understanding of Ghost's origins and capabilities. The laboratory they infiltrated was conducting research into accelerated evolution, using advanced genetic manipulation techniques to force rapid adaptation in captured alien specimens. The work was horrific, a systematic torture of sentient beings in the name of scientific advancement. Among the laboratory's files, Dex found records that mentioned the Nexari of Kepler 4042c specifically. The documents revealed that Ghost's species had been deliberately exposed to experimental mutagens before the moon's destruction, part of a larger project designed to create enhanced soldiers for Bashar, Kazeth's armies. The scarring that Ghost bore wasn't just the result of random cruelty. It was the systematic documentation of genetic modifications that had been forced upon an entire species. But the experiments had failed, or so the records claimed. The Nexari had proven incompatible with the enhancement process, their biology rejecting the modifications in ways that often proved fatal. Only a handful of specimens had survived the procedures, and these survivors had been deemed failures, creatures too damaged to be useful for military purposes. They had been abandoned on Kepler 4042 CE when the research project was terminated, left to die slowly on a world that was already dying. Ghost had been listening as Dex read through the files, and when he finished, the creature's reaction was profound. For the first time since their partnership began, Ghost displayed what could only be described as grief, a deep, keening sound that seemed to contain the accumulated sorrow of an entire species. Dex realized that Ghost had always known the truth about what had been done to its people, but had never had a way to communicate the full scope of the tragedy. The laboratory's destruction was swift and thorough. Ghost moved through the facility like an avatar of justice, systematically dismantling every piece of equipment and destroying every record of the abhorrent research. But the creature was careful to ensure that all the surviving test subjects were safely evacuated before the final demolition. Dex watched as Ghost personally carried several barely alive specimens to safety, its massive form moving with infinite gentleness as it tended to beings who had suffered as it once had. In the aftermath, as they were transferring the rescued specimens to a rehabilitation facility, Dex made a decision that surprised even himself. He announced his retirement from active mercenary work, explaining that he had found something more important than money or reputation. He was going to dedicate his remaining years to helping other survivors of the kind of trauma that Ghost had experienced, using his skills and resources to hunt down those who preyed on the innocent and defenseless. Ghost's reaction to this announcement was immediate and unmistakable approval. The creature had grown beyond its original purpose of vengeance, and had found a new calling in protection and healing. Together, they would continue to make a difference in the galaxy, but their methods would be guided by compassion rather than anger, by the desire to heal rather than harm. Their new mission began with the establishment of a sanctuary on a hidden world in the Outer Rim, a place where survivors of various forms of systematic abuse could find safety and begin the process of healing. The Iron Resolve was modified to serve as both transport and mobile medical facility, carrying supplies and personnel to remote locations where help was desperately needed. Ghost proved to be remarkably effective in this new role. The creature's empathic abilities allowed it to understand and communicate with traumatized beings in ways that conventional therapy couldn't match. Its presence alone seemed to have a calming effect on other survivors, as if they recognized in Ghost a kindred spirit who had endured similar suffering and emerged stronger. Over time, their sanctuary grew into a network of safe houses and rehabilitation centers scattered across the galaxy. Each facility was staffed by volunteers who had their own histories of survival and recovery, beings who understood from personal experience what it meant to rebuild one's life after systematic destruction. Ghost moved between these facilities like a guardian angel, its massive presence a reminder that even the most broken beings could find strength and purpose if given the chance. The transformation of their relationship was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this new phase of their lives. Where once Dex had been the protector and Ghost the protected, they now worked as true equals, each contributing their unique abilities to their shared mission. Dex provided the human perspective, the understanding of galactic politics and social dynamics that allowed them to navigate complex situations. Ghost provided the deeper wisdom, the instinctive understanding of suffering and healing that guided their efforts. Years passed, and their work continued. The galaxy slowly healed from the wounds that Kazeth and others like him had inflicted, but the scars remained. There would always be new tyrants, new systems of oppression, new forms of cruelty that required opposition. But there would also always be survivors, beings who had endured the worst that the universe could offer and had chosen to use their experience to help others. Dex grew older, his hair turning silver and his movements becoming slower. But Ghost seemed ageless, its massive form as powerful and vital as ever. The creature had somehow transcended the normal limitations of biological existence, becoming something that existed at the intersection of the physical and metaphysical. It had become, in essence, a living embodiment of the principle that love and loyalty could overcome any obstacle. On quiet evenings, when their work was done and they had time to reflect, Dex would often think about the chain of events that had brought them together. A moment of compassion on a dying world had led to a partnership that had changed the galaxy. A simple act of kindness toward a wounded creature had grown into something that touched countless lives across hundreds of worlds. He thought about the broken creature he had found in the ruins of Kepler 4042c, limping and afraid, barely clinging to life. That same being now stood as one of the most respected figures in the Outer Rim, a legend whose very name inspired hope in the hearts of the oppressed. The transformation was so complete, so profound, that it seemed almost impossible to believe they were the same being. But in quiet moments, when Ghost would curl up beside him, as it had in the early days of their partnership, Dex could still see traces of that frightened creature. The scars were still there, hidden beneath layers of natural armor, but never fully forgotten. The memories of pain and loss remained part of Ghost's essential being, but they had been transformed from sources of trauma into wellsprings of compassion. One day, as they were visiting one of their rehabilitation centers, Dex was approached by a young human woman who had recently been rescued from a trafficking operation. She was still bearing the physical and emotional wounds of her ordeal, but there was something in her eyes that reminded him of his younger self. A determination to not just survive, but to make a difference. "I want to help," she said simply. "I want to do what you and Ghost do. I want to make sure that what happened to me doesn't happen to others." Dex looked at her for a long moment, seeing in her face the same mixture of pain and resolve that had driven his own journey. Then he smiled and extended his hand. "Welcome to the family," he said. Ghost, who had been resting nearby, raised its great head, and fixed the young woman with its intelligent gaze. After a moment, the creature made a soft rumbling sound that Dex had learned to recognize as approval. Another survivor had chosen to transform their pain into purpose, and the network of healing would continue to grow. As the years continued to pass, Dex began to understand that their story was part of something larger, a fundamental shift in the way the galaxy approached questions of justice and mercy. The old ways, the cycles of violence and retribution that had defined interstellar politics for centuries, were slowly giving way to something more constructive. Beings who had once sought only revenge were learning to channel their pain into healing, their anger into protection of the innocent. Ghost had become more than just a partner or companion. It had become a symbol of transformation itself. The creature's journey from broken victim to powerful protector resonated with survivors across the galaxy, inspiring them to believe that their own healing was possible. Medical facilities, counseling centers, and support groups throughout known space displayed images of Ghost as a reminder that no wound was too deep to heal, no trauma too severe to overcome. But perhaps the most profound testament to Ghost's transformation came during their encounter with another Nexari survivor. The creature had been discovered on a remote research station, the last known member of its species besides Ghost. Like Ghost, it bore the scars of experimentation and abuse, but unlike Ghost, it had not found a path to healing. It was consumed with rage, lashing out at anyone who approached, lost in a cycle of pain and violence that seemed impossible to break. Ghost's response to this discovery was immediate and profound. The massive creature spent days sitting patiently outside the damaged Nexari's containment area, making soft vocalizations that seemed to carry some meaning beyond human understanding. Slowly, gradually, the other creature began to respond, its aggressive posture softening as it recognized something familiar in Ghost's presence. The healing process took months, but eventually the second Nexari emerged from its shell of rage and pain. Under Ghost's patient guidance, it began to engage with the world around it, to trust the beings who offered help rather than harm. It was a transformation that paralleled Ghost's own journey, proof that the power of compassion could overcome even the deepest wounds. Watching this process unfold, Dex was struck by the completeness of Ghost's evolution. The creature had not only healed from its own trauma, but had developed the ability to guide others through similar journeys. It had become a teacher, a healer, a living example of the possibility of redemption and renewal. As they prepared to welcome the second Nexari into their network of sanctuaries, Dex reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them to this point. From the ruins of a dying world to the heights of galactic influence, from a broken creature and a cynical mercenary to partners in the greatest rescue operation in known history. Their story had become something larger than either of them could have imagined. The galaxy was not yet healed, might never be completely healed. There would always be new forms of cruelty to oppose, new victims to rescue, new survivors to help along the path to recovery. But the foundation had been laid, the example had been set, and the network of healing continued to grow stronger with each passing day. Standing in the observation deck of the Iron Resolve, looking out at the stars that held so many worlds touched by their work, Dex felt a profound sense of completion. Not the completion of ending, but the completion of purpose fulfilled and destiny embraced. He had found something worth living for, worth fighting for, worth dedicating his life to achieving. Beside him, Ghost stood as still as a statue, its great form silhouetted against the starfield. But Dex could feel the contentment radiating from his partner, the deep satisfaction of a being who had not only survived the worst that the universe could offer, but had used that experience to make the universe a better place. They had come full circle, from the dying moon where their partnership began, to a galaxy-spanning network of hope and healing. The broken alien pup that had limped through the ruins of Kepler 442 CE had grown into something magnificent, not despite its scars, but because of them. And in saving that creature, Dex had ultimately saved himself, finding in their partnership a purpose that transcended his own mortality. The story that had begun with an act of simple compassion had grown into legend, but at its heart, it remained what it had always been, a testament to the transformative power of love, loyalty, and the refusal to let cruelty have the final word. In a galaxy that often seemed dominated by violence and despair, they had proven that hope could survive, that healing was possible, and that even the most broken beings could find their way to wholeness. As the iron resolve carried them toward their next mission, their next opportunity to make a difference, Dex knew that their work would continue long after he was gone. Ghost would carry on their mission, training new partners, inspiring new survivors, ensuring that the network of healing they had built would endure. The legacy they had created together would outlive them both, a living monument to the principle that every being deserved a chance at redemption. The dying moon of Kepler 4042 Ca still orbited its distant star, still bore the scars of violence and loss. But it was no longer just a graveyard, a monument to cruelty triumphant. It had become the birthplace of something greater, the starting point of a journey that had touched countless lives and changed the fundamental nature of how the galaxy approached questions of justice and mercy. And in the end, that transformation, that evolution, from destruction to healing, from vengeance to compassion, from brokenness to wholeness, was perhaps the greatest victory of all. The throne of tyranny had been torn in half, not just by Ghost's claws, but by the power of love to transform even the deepest wounds into sources of strength and wisdom. Their story continued, would always continue, carried forward by every being they had helped, every life they had touched, every survivor who chose healing over hatred. The broken alien pup and the cynical mercenary had become something neither could have achieved alone, a force for transformation that would echo through the galaxy for generations to come. In the quiet of hyperspace, surrounded by the gentle hum of the iron resolve's engines, Dex and Ghost settled in for the long journey ahead. There would be new challenges, new opportunities to make a difference, new chances to prove that the universe's capacity for cruelty was more than matched by its capacity for compassion. And somewhere in the outer rim, on worlds they had yet to visit, beings who had given up hope would soon discover that help was coming, that their suffering had not been forgotten, and that healing was possible even for the most frail. Broken among them. The legend would continue to grow, but more importantly, the work would continue. One rescue at a time, one healed heart at a time, one transformed life at a time. The galaxy was vast, filled with countless worlds and uncounted beings. But it was also connected, linked by invisible threads of shared experience and common hope. And at the center of that web of connection, a former mercenary and his impossible partner continued their endless mission, proving every day that love truly could conquer all, that loyalty could transcend death, and that even the most broken beings could find their way to wholeness. The story had no ending, because it was still being written, still being lived, still transforming everything it touched into something better than what came before. And that, perhaps, was the greatest testament of all to the power of a simple act of kindness performed on a dying moon so many years ago.